Welcome to the week number 8 overview for microeconomic principles here at Rutgers University in Camden. And in this week, one of the chapters we're discussing is Chapter 13, Monopoly and Antitrust Policy. So it's a good idea to make sure you have a good notion of what perfect competition is so we can compare and contrast that to monopoly. If we remember, a number of assumptions underlie the logic of perfect competition. Among them, a large number of firms and households are interacting in each market. Firms in a given market produce undifferentiated or homogeneous products, and new firms are free to enter industries and compete for profits. The first two imply that firms have no control over input prices or output prices. The third implies that opportunities for positive profit are eliminated in the long run. So when we go to the actual chapter, we're going to take a look at imperfect competition and market power and the concepts related to that. And remember that a market in which individual firms have some control over price is imperfectly competitive. Such firms exercise market power. The three forms of imperfect competition are monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. A pure monopoly is an industry with a single firm that produces a product for which there are no close substitutes and in which there are significant barriers to entry. So make sure you remember the issue of barriers to entry when it comes to monopoly. Market power means that the firm must make 4 decisions instead of 3. So in monopoly, there are 4 decisions, where in perfect competition, there are 3. In monopoly, they have to decide how much to produce, how to produce it, what quantity of each input to buy, and what price to charge for their output. So a monopoly is jointly setting price and output, while in perfect competition, price is given, and the firm operating in a perfectly competitive marketplace is just setting output. Market power does not imply that a monopolist can charge any price it wants. Make sure you remember that. Monopolies are constrained by the market demand. They can only sell what people will buy and only at a price that people are willing to pay. So it's important that in that section that you understand this, and in particular, make sure you understand how that differs between perfect competition and monopoly. The next section is price and output decisions in monopoly markets. If you remember, in perfect competitions, many firms supply homogeneous products. With only one firm in a monopoly market, however, there is no distinction between the firm and the industry. The firm is the industry. The market demand curve is thus the firm's demand curve, and the total quantity supplied in the market is what the monopoly firm decides to produce. For a monopolist, an increase in output involves not just producing more and selling it, but also reducing the price its output to sell at. So make sure you realize that a monopolist, if it wants to sell more, has to lower price because it is constrained by the demand curve. Thus, marginal revenue to a monopolist is not equal to the product price, as it is in competition. Instead, marginal revenue is lower than the price because to raise output 1 unit and to be able to sell that 1 unit, the firm must lower the price it charges to all buyers. So make sure you remember that in a perfectly competitive marketplace, demand and marginal revenue were equal to one another, but in monopoly, marginal revenue is less than the demand curve. A profit-maximizing monopolist will produce up to the point at which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So that profit-maximizing condition is the same in monopoly, marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. Also remember that monopolies have no identifiable supply curve as opposed to perfect competition. They simply choose a point on the market demand curve. That is, they choose a price and quantity to produce which depend on the shapes of both the marginal cost and the demand curves. And also, barriers to entry prevent new entrants from competing away industry profits. So in perfect competition, profits act as a signal for entry, whereas in monopoly, there are significant barriers to entry, so this entry will not occur. We also take a look at the social costs of monopoly. When firms when firms price above marginal cost, the result is an inefficient mix of output. The decrease in consumer surplus is larger than the monopolist profits, thus causing a net loss to social welfare. So a monopoly market is less efficient than a perfectly competitive market. Actions that firms take to preserve positive profits, such as lobbying for restrictions on competition, are called rent-seeking. Make sure you remember this term. Rent-seeking behavior consumes resources and adds to social costs, thus reducing the social welfare even further in a monopoly market. Monopolists will attempt to engage in price discrimination, which is charging different prices to different buyers. So make sure you remember that definition. Charging different prices to different buyers is called price discrimination. The motivation for price discrimination is fairly obvious. If a firm can identify those who are willing to pay a higher price for a good, it can earn more profit from them by charging a higher price. A firm that charges the maximum amount that buyers are willing to pay for each unit is practicing perfect price discrimination. So make sure you understand the concepts of what is price discrimination, how they engage in it, and also distinguish between what is perfect price discrimination. And the chapter also goes over remedies for monopoly. Governments have assumed two roles with respect to imperfectly competitive marketplaces. So realize that this is partially about government intervention, which is called Antitrust Policy. They promote competition and restrict market power, primarily through antitrust laws and other congressional acts. They restrict competition by regulating industries. So make sure you realize that the role of government as seen in regulating monopolies. The next chapter that we go over is oligopoly. Make sure you understand what oligopoly is and how it differs from monopoly. So the first part of the chapter talks about market structure and oligopoly. An oligopoly is an industry dominated by a few firms that, by virtue of their individual sizes, are large enough to influence market price. The behavior of a single oligopolistic firm depends on the reactions it expects of all other firms in the industry. Industrial strategies usually are very complicated and difficult to generalize about. So that's a key distinction about oligopoly, this interaction of decision-making, oftentimes strategic decision-making. For example, if I am in an oligopoly market, if I decide to change the price of my product, I not only have to be concerned about the impact on consumers, but I have to have some notion of how my competitors will react to any strategy that I engage in. Have a good notion about the five forces model, as it is a helpful way to organize economic knowledge about the structure of oligopolistic industries. By gathering data on an industry structure in terms of the existing rivals, new entrants, substitutes, and buyer and supplier characteristics, we can better understand the sources of excess profits in an oligopoly industry. We also go over specific oligopoly models. When firms collude, either explicitly or tacitly, they jointly maximize profits by charging an agreed-to price or by setting output limits and splitting profits. The result is the same as if it would be if one firm monopolized the industry. The firm will produce up to a point at which marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal, and the price will be set above marginal cost. One of the first types of models is the price leadership model of oligopoly, and this leads to a result similar but not identical to the collusion model. In this organization, the dominant firm in the industry sets a price and allows competing firms to supply all they want at that price. An oligopoly with a dominant price leader will produce a level of output between what would prevail under competition and what a monopolist would choose in the same industry. An oligopoly will also set price between the monopoly price and the competitive price. Additionally, there is another model called the Cournot Model. The Cournot Model of oligopoly is based upon three assumptions: that there are a few firms in an industry, that each firm takes the output of the other as given, and that firms maximize profits. The models hold that a series of output adjustment decisions leads to a final level of output between that which would prevail under perfect competition and that which would be set by monopoly. All of this has led to the development of a field in economics known as game theory, and it analyzes the behavior of firms as if their behavior were a series of strategic moves and counter moves. So it's important, as this is a growing field in economics, to understand the importance of game theory and strategic behavior. It is important because it helps us understand the problem of oligopoly, focusing on the complex interactions amongst those firms. We also, in the chapter, look at oligopoly and economic performance. Concentration in markets often leads to the price above marginal cost and output below the efficient level. Market concentration, however, can lead to gains from economies of scale and may promote innovation. Finally, we take a look at the role of government. For example, the Clayton Act of 1914 gave the government the authority to limit mergers that might substantially lessen competition in the industry. The Seller-Kefauver Act of 1950 enabled the Justice Department to move against such mergers. Currently, the Justice Department uses the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index to determine whether it will challenge a proposed merger. So make sure you're comfortable with what the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is and how it is calculated. And also, the book goes over briefly that there are some arguments that the regulation of mergers is no longer a proper role of government.